gonna say that song always gets me. Wow. Well, it's so good to be back with you all again, to see your faces, to hear your voices, and to know that we're in a interesting time, but together we are making significant meaning. And so today I'm hopeful that we'll do that even more. I have been talking a lot about hope. I've been doing some work on my blog and been doing sermons around hope. But hope isn't the only thing that's been stirring in my soul as of late. And so I wanted to touch upon that a little bit today. And I know that we are a Unitarian group, and where Christ is not the central figure in what we do, but you're going to get a lot of Jesus today. But stay with me. I hope to take you and have a safe landing. But I surmise that during difficult times like we are living in, what we discover about ourselves can be very telling. I believe that our national character is on display, and I can tell you that I am consistently shocked at some of the things I am hearing and seeing on social media and in the daily news cycle. There are things that truly break my heart, in particular regarding how we relate and care for one another. If what we are witnessing is truly who we are, then I ask, who are we destined to become? Whatever we see in the character of our nation is the culmination of millions of actions we have taken and choices we have made since our founding that brought us to this point. These revelations certainly foretell the future we are guaranteed if we continue on the trajectory that we are on. Determining who we might become requires an examination, a recognition of who we have already been. And since much of our current political dialogue takes place against the backdrop of a campaign slogan that is calling us to return to America's greatness, we may need to negotiate and define collectively what constitutes a national greatness in the first place, and then presumably look for the times in our history when this greatness was epitomized, embodied, and realized. So let us examine the character of our greatness. Our history books are filled with valiant stories of the Puritans' arrival on Plymouth and the friendly feast with the natives. You remember those books? From my grade school textbooks, I can recall the smiling faces of the Indians as the mostly Christian explorers, not invaders, I would have you, would go on to colonize them. We are often reminded that at the pinnacle of our greatness, we have shared our bounties with those less fortunate than ourselves. In some instances, we have given as much as or more than we have taken. And it would have been great if that were the full narrative, but it's not. America's so-called greatness also rests on the top of the graves of millions of stolen, broken, and abused souls. From the mass slaughter and violence against the native Indians, or quote-unquote savages in the early years, to the dislocation of tribes during the Trail of Tears as part of the Western expansion, which is powered by a theory called manifest destiny, to the Osage Indians in Oklahoma during the last century who were killed and their property and wealth stolen, as detailed in David Grant's book, Killer of the Flower Moon. And I literally cried when I read this book. I would encourage you all to read it. Again, Killers of the Flower Moon. Our greatness is further established by the 400 years of barbaric slavery through abuse, rape, and forced labor of Black bodies that enabled the birth and growth of a nation. The spoils of slavery created wealthy landowners, the haves, sparking manufacturing and industrial growth. Plainly speaking, our greatness is built on oppression and terrorism, as thousands of Black bodies swung on Southern lynching trees, as white crowds dressed in their Sunday best picnicked outside after observing the execution. Our greatness is supported by oppressive systems like the Jim Crow that created a second-class citizenry with segregation and redlining and disenfranchisement, while many repercussions continuing today, like the mass incarceration, lack of educational opportunities, and health disparities for the people of color, whom we now see bearing the brunt of the COVID-19 crisis. There are numerous other examples of America's character. I could mention our standing on the sidelines as 6 million Jews were slaughtered during the Holocaust, or our displacement of the Japanese Americans during World War II, or our tacit approval of the first Gulf War based on what we now know was a fabrication, and that led to many thousands of deaths. I could go on, but you get the gist. That's probably enough. I've wondered, while many hold to the notion that we are a Christian nation, while not always acting Christian. And as of late, people from all over the world have been asking, what's going on with America? Who is America revealing itself to be? Recently, I heard one politician say that we should let the elderly die to save the economy. I have heard yet another politician say not only the elderly, but the poor as well. He clarified by saying anyone who is not contributing, but is basically a drain on the system. We have heard Christian preachers say that God wanted the current president to nuke other nations. I've heard it said that even that slavery was a good thing. We've heard so much from the mouths of well-meaning people, and many of them Christian, who are unashamed about blessing you in Jesus' name while denying others the basics, such as food, water, medical help, and human dignity. I'm reminded of the words of Gandhi, who purportedly stated, "I like your Christ, but I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ." He could clearly see the disparity between the life and works of Jesus and the words and actions of many of his followers. No, this is not the Jesus I know. And now it appears the wedding seems to have been consummated between the political right and conservative Christianity, with this radical individualism central to the objectivist philosophy founded by Ayn Rand, who has become a beacon in the libertarian movement. The 1964 presidential candidate Barry Goldwater's rugged individualism, which is best espoused by the idea of pulling oneself up by one's bootstrap, and is a current political mantra, was also closely aligned with Ayn Rand's, and both draw from some of the teachings of Aristotle. Rand's philosophy asserted that the individual should, quote, exist for his own sake, neither sacrificing himself to others nor sacrificing others to himself, end quote. The latter is often overlooked in our history. As most marginalized community will attest, they're often sacrificed or exploited by the powers that be. Rand condemned ethical altruism as incompatible with the requirements of human life and individual happiness. Now, this is not a philosophy of collective mutuality, sacrifice, and service for the common good. The altruistic message about the single garment of mutuality that Dr. King and Gandhi and so many others espouse are deemed threats to one's personal social order and freedom. This is why during this pandemic, signs that read, "I will not give up my freedom for your safety," are openly displayed. This is why you might not find it so strange that someone would say something like, "The weak and elderly should die," or "the poor be exposed to the COVID-19 because they are vulnerable." The wager of aristocracy is the survival of the fittest. This is a worldview that seems to be taking strong roots in our society, and Christianity has aligned itself with it. The "what would Jesus say" mantra is swallowed up by what Jesus is actually doing, and we're seeing that. The Jesus that we see is vindictive, mean-spirited, a mean-spirited malcontent, bent on sowing racial and class division. This Jesus lacks credibility, willingly putting his flock at risk of a pandemic, which he, by the way, sent to cleanse the nation of its poor and marginalized, and apparently the elderly, so he could be worshiped in a building. The Jesus we see doesn't bless his enemies, but rather curses and name calls them daily. The Jesus we see allows children to be locked in cages, separated from their parents, saying because you dared to break the law by coming into our country illegally, you don't deserve compassion, help, or service. This Jesus winks at racism, sexism, misogyny, and xenophobia while claiming the moral high ground. This Jesus is truly unrecognizable. It is identity and racial politics that are at play at the southern border. It's not about helping the poor, welcoming the stranger, or loving one's enemies as Christ taught. It's about racial and social class maintaining its supremacy. Most Christians support the current enacted border policies, even though nearly 70% of the migrants that are coming across the border are either Protestant or Catholic Christians fleeing desperate situations in their home countries. This is an indication that white Christians are more politically attuned than religiously sensitive, even when other Christians are at risk. The Christian church, and I mean particularly conservative Christianity, not all, because some of them are doing great work, but many have brought much reproach upon the character and name of Jesus, that even atheists and agnostics are having to defend the character of Jesus from those who claim to follow him. Let me repeat this. We have reached a point in our history when atheists and agnostics are having to set Christians straight about who Jesus is. Somebody ought to say amen to that. The Jesus we know didn't align himself with a political party. In fact, he was against the political empire of his day, probably because he knew politics are primarily about partisanship and division. He had empathy and cared for the oppressed, the disinherited, and the disenfranchised. The Jesus we know was for the common good of the community and encouraged the community to care for its widows, the orphans, and the poor. The Jesus we know believed in health care, no buts about it. He is the original healer. And the one needs only to read the story of the Good Samaritan to know that how Jesus felt about caring for the stranger among us. He was a man who found great pleasure in hanging out with the poor and the destitute, the rejects, and even the prostitutes, the drunkards, and so on. And even hung out with the despised tax collectors. He was a weeping Jesus, a compassionate, empathetic friend who cried at Mary's loss of her brother Lazarus. But if we allow for this worldview to take hold, we will encounter a Jesus who is no longer the master of compassion, who had a mission of a united, diverse, hopeful, and healing community, but one who demonstrates and honors individualism, tribalism, and division. And don't think that we are not affected by the God that others believe in. I shared this in another reflection once before, that even though many of us don't believe fundamentalist Christianity or the way they believe, that some of us are atheists or agnostic, we're all affected by people who actually believe in God as they go out and behave in the ways in which they think that their God is telling them. And it affects us all, has the potential of affecting us all. In the next 20 years or so, I can see Christians mimicking a Jesus that hates everyone they hate. If one cannot see the potentiality of history repeating itself in one of the above mentioned travesties, then one chooses not to see. Those of us who are looking are seeing the seeds of fascism reveal itself in real time. Should we fail to respond, to act in response to this ideology, it will take stronghold, and the future of the beloved community will be lost, a casualty of our blindness. If you cannot see the potentiality of a future where there is widespread criminalization of people of color, LGBTQ folk, the elderly, the poor, the disabled, then one chooses not to see. Speaking about our time in the White House, Michelle Obama said that being president doesn't change who you are, it reveals who you are. This revealing phenomenon isn't just for presidents, preachers, or Fortune 500 CEOs, all of whom undoubtedly face enormous challenges, but for all of us, the rich, the poor, everyday people like you and me. Pressure reveals one's true character. We all experience hardships and difficulties. Much of what we experience doesn't necessarily change who we are, but quite often it reveals one's true nature. And such revealing may even be a shock to our own selves. Perhaps none of this should be a surprise to any, like the folks who bought excessive, superabundant amounts of supplies during this pandemic, a truckload of toilet paper or thousands of cases of hand sanitizers. Now, I won't judge any of them, but I have an idea or two about what may have compelled them to do what they did. It is likely that their actions were based on fear, or perhaps they were opportunists who saw a way to make a quick buck by reselling the items for profit. I'm sure you have a few pandemic stories of your own. These are indeed strange days. But throughout our history, there have been countless stories of people doing great things when under pressure and facing challenges and hardships. The examples include Harriet Tubman, who risked her own life leading slaves to freedom on the Underground Railroad, the abolitionist who lost lives and treasure for standing with the enslaved community, the tremendous sacrifices and courages of our great number of our soldiers throughout many years. Police officers running toward an invisible sniper in Las Vegas and Dallas, and gunfire at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, or those standing against systemic injustice and police brutality in the Black Lives Matter movement. Even recently, multitudes of first responders and medical professionals have put themselves in harm's way by putting others' needs above their own. Some paid dearly for it, and their sacrifice and heroism will not be forgotten. As a chaplain at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Durham, I have seen many acts of courage. Once, while supporting a family whose loved one had passed away, the veteran's spouse remarked that she was so heartbroken that she could not be there for him when he passed away. You see, since the pandemic, no family members have been allowed in the hospital rooms of those who are ill. And I've heard many heartbreaking stories all across our nation. As people are dying, they do so alone because there's no one there. And I can't imagine. I just can't imagine not being by the side of my closest loved ones, as someone so close as they pass away. It's unthinkable. Or if I'm passing away, that I'm alone and there's no one there with me, I just can't imagine. When the veteran's spouse expressed her grief and regret, I validated her feelings. But the nurse chimed in and said, "Oh, honey, I was here. I was sitting here at his bedside, holding his hand as he passed away." And then, probably in violation of all social distance guidelines, the two women, the widow and the nurse, embraced and held each other as they both cried. I will never forget the compassion that this nurse showed to this family. Our American vision and values have in some way held us together, but they also create deep divides and conflict. And many of us sense the heavy weight of this nation's sins, missing the mark, falling short of our principles and values on its collective conscience. We had hope that in some way our values of generosity and helping other nations, sharing our fortunes, our hospitality and concern for others are somehow supposed to exonerate or excuse our past transgressions without our having to admit the guilt or face a reckoning of some sort. And my fear is what the old proverb says about our failure to learn from our past. We are in fact doomed to repeat it. In dark times, we've been reminded of our highest ideals, our national values to rely on, those enshrined in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the Declaration of Independence that reads that we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men, and I feel that we can update that saying to say all genders, are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So I'm not as much concerned about who Christians are revealing Jesus to be in our time, but primarily my concern is an individual one. Who will I be? Who will you become? I realize that in this current season, we've all been feeling a lot, and I'm so tired of feeling, or shall I say, having my feelings so present and out front. We are all raw, open, and exposed. Most likely, all of us are experiencing COVID fatigue, but we have hope, knowing that this season shall pass, and it will. But what will remain? Considering this question, this is a great time to self-reflect on the condition of our humanity. What we emit into the world and our place in it, and our responsibility to it and to each other. If our worldview embraces our being a member of the beloved community, then I must inform you that it requires that we continue to feel. Like Jesus, who was said to have been touched by the feelings of our weaknesses, bruised by our failings, and shared solidarity in our suffering, we too must bear the burdens of others. This is the garment of mutuality. And Jesus also wept. I've been reading James Cone's book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, where he describes what could possibly be one of the first steps in addressing these issues. He mentions social activist William Stringfellow, who was addressing white social activists wanting to do something practical for racial reconciliation. Stringfellow simply said for them to do, he said, weep. First, he went on to say, first, care enough to weep. In our tears, as we see and confess, we are called to solidarity in acts of reconciliation and righteousness. Weeping seems like a very practical starting point. We can cry for our nation, weep for our children, our elderly, the broken, disenfranchised, disinherited, and the disowned. Perhaps our weeping would then spark a prayer or meditation. Then that prayer spark a vision of what is truly possible. A vision that then ignites committed action, which propels us into greater possibilities of making a world that we hope someday will be. One of generosity, kindness, equality, and mutuality. A world where we overcome evil with good, knowing far well that evil persists when good people do nothing. We do something. We first weep. Of course, I could talk more about strategic plans for helping us to realize and reveal the true beloved communities. There are countless ideas out there, many of them complex and seemingly out of reach. I can encourage you to continue to fight, to resist, to speak out when you see injustice, and I know that you will do this. But in the end, what we desire to see manifested in the character of our nation will be what we manifest in our own lives, and what we support in what our leaders also are doing and what they manifest. Besides weeping, there is one more thing that we can do. And President Obama said it best. With all the chaos, confusion, accusations, threats, he too offered just one word of truth for us all to consider. And he said, vote. Amen.